Why can't I see my chat in Streamlabs? That's so weird. Hold on. If anyone's saying anything to me, I can't see what you're saying. Because, like, I don't know. Streamlabs not letting me see my chat for some reason. So, like, give me a sec. Oh my god. I hate. Oh my god. I need to log. Oh my. This... Okay. How do I see my chat? It's so weird. Yeah, I can just like look directly on my channel. Hold on, let me go to my channel just to see if anyone's like said anything, because I don't know, and I'm having trouble like logging into Restream. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Okay. How do I?
A world of warriors.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I got it. All right. If only I could open my chat on Streamlabs, but like I don't really know how to do that. So I guess that's probably it. Okay, so should I just start reading then? I don't know. I'll give it like 2 more minutes, and I'll start reading again at 5:30. For those of you who don't know or who might be watching and are not typing anything in chat, cry very lonely. But also, more importantly, if you don't know, I'm reading the last, I'm guessing this is around 30 or so pages, 27, I guess, pages of Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg, Marxist theorist. I read the other parts and the others in another stream that I did a while back. So if you haven't listened to that, you probably should, because if you start at page 45, you'd probably be a bit confused. So yeah. Okay, 1 more minute, and I'm gonna spend that 1 minute seeing if I can get my chat back in Streamlabs. Here, just driving. Hi, Justin. Uh, okay. How do I get my thing back in Streamlabs? My chat. Sorry for not saying anything. I could think of anything to say. No, it's okay. Uh, this is okay. If any of you know how Streamlabs works, do you know why I can't see my chat? Because like I used to be able to see my chat in Streamlabs, and now it's like not the case. But I guess like it doesn't matter anyway. I can still see it, the chat here. So okay, I'll start again, and yeah, in about uh 8 o'clock. So that's 2.5 hours. In about 2.5 hours, I am gonna Well, that's when the debate's gonna start. So we're gonna be watching the debate and commenting on it and probably laughing because I don't expect it to be not hilarious. I mean, the first one is pretty funny. If I had streamed that one, I would have laughed quite a lot and expect to laugh this time. In fact, should I get high? I have no idea. I don't know. But I'm definitely gonna eat before because last time I ate was like 2 hours ago. And if I'm going to be eating this for the next 2 hours, then I'm probably going to want to eat. So, hi Wayne. Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna start again. I should get high. Fuck it. Okay, fine. Fine, I can do that. But then I'm gonna want to eat. I'm gonna want like candy or something. So like, I'm probably gonna uh turn off my webcam for a bit. But yeah, I can do that, I guess. Okay. So, cooperatives, unions, and democracy. Bernstein's socialism offers the workers the prospect of sharing in the wealth of society. The poor are to become rich. How will this socialism be brought about? His articles, just a reminder to everyone, Edward Bernstein, big sock them. He's like the founder of modern sockdemism. He's a sock them. Yeah. Anyways, his articles, Problems of Socialism and Neue Zeit, contain only vague hints on this question. Adequate information, however, can be found in his book. Bernstein's socialism is to be realized with the aid of two instruments: labor unions, or as Bernstein himself characterizes them, economic democracy, and cooperatives. The first will suppress industrial profit, the second will do away with commercial profit. Cooperatives, especially in the field of production, constitute a hybrid form in the midst of capitalism. They can be described as small units of socialized production within capitalist exchange. But in the capitalist economy, exchange dominates production and, as a result of competition, ruthless exploitation, i.e., the complete control of the production process by the interests of capital, becomes a condition for the survival of each enterprise. The domination of capital over the process of production expresses itself in the following ways. Labor is intensified, the working days lengthened or shortened, according to the situation of the market. And depending on the requirements of the market, labor is either employed or thrown back into the streets. In other words, use is made of all methods that enable an enterprise to stand up against its competitors. The workers forming a cooperative in the field of production are thus faced with a contradictory necessity of governing themselves with the utmost absolutism. They're obliged to play the role of the capitalist entrepreneur towards themselves, a contradiction that accounts for the usual failure of cooperatives in production, which which either become pure capitalist enterprises or, if the workers' interests continue to predominate, end by dissolving. Bernstein, Bernstein himself has taken note of these facts, but it is evident that he has not understood them, for together with Smith's Potterweb, okay, uh, he explains the failure of cooperatives in production in England by their lack of discipline. But what is so superficially and flatly called here discipline is nothing else than the natural regime of capitalism, which, it is plain, the workers cannot successfully use against themselves. Producers' cooperatives can survive within capitalist economy only if they manage to suppress, by means of some detour, the capitalist-controlled contradictions between the mode of production and the mode of exchange, and they can accomplish this only by removing themselves artificially from the influence of the laws of free competition. And they can succeed in doing the last only when they assure themselves beforehand of a constant circle of consumers, that is, when they assure themselves of a constant market. It is the consumers' cooperatives that it is the consumers' cooperative that can offer this service to its brother in the field of production. Here, and not in Oppenheimer's distinction between the cooperatives that produce and cooperatives that sell, it is a secret thought sought by Bernstein, the explanation for the invariable failure of producers' cooperatives that function independently, and the survival of those backed by consumers' organizations. If it is true that the possibility for the existence of the producers' cooperatives within capitalism is bound up with the possibility of the existence of consumers' cooperatives, then the scope of the former is limited, in the most favorable of cases, to the small local market and to the manufacture of articles serving immediate needs, especially food products. Consumers, and therefore producers' cooperatives, are excluded from the most important branches of production: the textiles, mining, metallurgical, and petroleum industries, machine and locomotive construction, and shipbuilding. For this reason alone, forgetting for the moment their hybrid character, cooperatives in the field of production cannot be seriously considered as the instrument of a general social transformation. The establishment of producers' cooperatives on a wide scale would suppose, first of all, the suppression of the world market, the breaking up of the present world economy into small local spheres of production and exchange. The highly developed capitalism of our time is expected to fall back into the merchant economy of the Middle Ages. Within the present Within the framework of present society, such producers' cooperatives are limited to the role of simple annexes to consumers' cooperatives. It appears, therefore, that the latter must be the beginning of the proposed social change. But the way in which they expect to, but the way but this way, the expected reform of society by means of cooperatives ceases to be an offensive against capitalist production. That is, it ceases to be an attack against the principal basis of capitalist economy. It becomes instead a struggle against commercial capital, especially small and medium-sized commercial capital. It becomes an attack made on the twigs of the capitalist tree. According to Bernstein, trade unions too are a means of attack against capitalism in the field of production. We have already shown that trade unions cannot give workers influence over production, either as regards the scale of production or the technical process of production. This much may be said about the purely economic side of the struggle of the rate of wages against the rate of profit, as Bernstein labels the activity of the trade union. But it does not take place in the blue sky. It takes place within the well-defined framework of the law of wages. The law of wages is not shattered but realized by trade union activity. According to Bernstein, it is the trade unions that lead, in the general movement for the emancipation of the working class, the real attack against the rate of industrial profits. According to Bernstein, trade unions have the task of transforming the rate of industrial profit into rates of wages. The fact that the trade unions are at least able to execute an economic offensive against profit. Trade unions are nothing more than the organized defense of workers against the attacks of profit. They express the resistance offered by the working class to the oppression of capitalist economy. This for two reasons. First, trade unions influence the market situation of labor power, but this influence is being constantly overcome by the proletarianization of the middle layers of society, which continually brings new labor power onto the market. The second function of the trade unions is to ameliorate the condition of workers. That is, they attempt to increase the share of social wealth going to the working class. This share, however, is being reduced with the fatality of a natural process by the growth of the productivity of labor. One does not need to be a Marxist to notice this. It suffices to read Robertus's In Explanation of the Social Question. In other words, the objective conditions of capitalist society transform the two economic functions of the trade unions into a sort of labor of Sisyphus, which is nevertheless indispensable. For, as a result of the activity of his trade unions, the worker succeeds in obtaining for himself the rate of wages due to him in accordance with the situation of the on the labor market. As a result of trade union activity, the capitalist law of wages is applied and the effect of the depressing tendency of economic development is paralyzed, or to be more exact, attenuated. However, the transformation of the trade union into an instrument of the progressive reduction of profit in favor of wages presupposes the following social conditions. First, the cessation of the proletarianization of the middle strata of our society. Second, a stoppage of the growth of productivity of labor. We have in both cases a return to pre-capitalist conditions. Cooperatives and trade unions are totally incapable of transforming the capitalist mode of production. Bernstein is dimly aware of this, for he refers to cooperatives and trade unions as a means of reducing the profit of the capitalists and thus enriching the workers. In this way, he renounces the struggle against the capitalist mode of production and attempts to direct the socialist movement towards the struggle against capitalist distribution. Again and again, Bernstein refers to socialism as an effort towards a fair, equitable, and still more equitable mode of distribution. Of course, the unfair distribution characteristic of capitalism gives an impetus to the socialist movement among the masses. When social democracy struggles for the socialization of the entire economy, it aspires also to a fair distribution of the social wealth. But, guided by Marx's observation that the mode of distribution at given epoch of a given epoch is a natural consequence of the mode of production of that epoch, social democracy does not struggle for fair distribution within the framework of capitalist production. It struggles instead for the suppression of capitalism. In a word, social democracy wants to establish socialist distribution by suppressing the capitalist mode of production. Bernstein's method, on the contrary, proposes to combat the capitalist mode of distribution in the hopes of gradually establishing, in this way, the socialist mode of production. What, in that case, is the basis of Bernstein's program for the reform of society? Does it find support in the definite tendencies of capitalist production? No. In the first place, he denies such tendencies. In the second place, the socialist transformation in production is, for him, the effect and not the cause of distribution. He cannot give his program a materialist base, because he has already overthrown the aims and the means of the movement for socialism, and therefore its economic conditions. As a result, he is obliged to construct himself in an idealist base. Why represent socialism as a consequence of economic compulsion, he complains? Why degrade man's understanding, his feeling for justice, his will? Bernstein's superlatively fair distribution is to be attained thanks to man's free will, man's will acting not because of an economic necessity, since his will is only an instrument, but because of man's comprehension of justice, because of man's idea of justice. We thus quite happily return to the principle of justice, to the old warhorse on which the reformers of the earth have rocked for ages, for the lack of surer means of historic transportation. We return to the lamentable Rocinante. I don't know what that is. On which is this a reference to Don Quixote? Okay. On which the Don Quixotes of history have galloped towards the great reform of the earth, always to come home with a black eye. The relation of the poor to the rich, taken as a basis, went to debate at 8 o'clock. The relation of the poor to the rich, taken as a base for socialism, the principle of cooperation as the content of socialism, the most fair distribution as its aim, and the idea of justice as its only historic legitimization. With how much more force and more fire did Waitling defend that sort of socialism 50 years ago? However, that genius of a Taylor did not know scientific socialism. If today the conception torn into pieces by Marx and Engels half a century ago is patched up and presented to the proletariat as the last word of social justice, that too is the art of a Taylor, but it has nothing of a genius about it. Trade unions and cooperatives are the economic support of the theory of revisionism. Its principal political condition is the growth of democracy. The present manifestations of political reaction are, to Bernstein, only convulsions. He considers them accidental, momentary, and suggests that they are not to be considered in the elaboration of the general directives of the labor movement. To Bernstein, democracy is an inevitable stage in the development of society. To him, as to the bourgeois theoreticians of liberalism, democracy is the great fundamental law of historical development, the realization of which is served by all forces of political life. However, Bernstein's thesis is completely false. Presented in this absolute form, it appears as a petty bourgeois vulgarization of the results of a very short phase of bourgeois development, that lasts 25 or 30 years. We reach entirely different conclusions when we examine the historical development of democracy a little closer and consider at the same time the general political history of capitalism. Democracy has been founded the most dissimilar social formations in primitive communist societies, in the slaves of antiquity, and in medieval communes. Similarly, absolutism and constitutional monarchy are to be found under the most varied economic orders. When capitalism began with the first production of commodities, it resorted to a democratic constitution in the municipal communes of the Middle Ages. Later, when it developed manufacturing, capitalism found its corresponding political form in the absolute monarchy. Finally, as a developed industrial economy, it brought into being in France the Democratic Republic of 1793, the absolute monarchy of Napoleon I, the nobles' monarchy of the Restoration period 1915 to 30, the bourgeois constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe, and again the Democratic Republic, and against the monarchy of Napoleon III, and for the third time, for the Republic. In Germany, the only true democratic institution, universal suffrage, is not a conquest of bourgeois liberalism. Here it was an instrument for the fusion of the small states. It is only in this sense that it has any importance for the development of the German bourgeoisie, which is otherwise quite satisfied with the semi-feudal constitutional monarchy. In Russia, capitalism prospered for a long time under Oriental absolutism, without the bourgeoisie manifesting the least desire to introduce democracy. In Austria, universal suffrage was above all a lifeblood thrown into a foundering and decomposing monarchy. In Belgium, the conquest of universal suffrage by the labor movement was due to the weakness of the local militarism, and consequently to the special geographic and political situation. What we have here a bit of democracy, and that has not been won not by the bourgeoisie but against it. The uninterrupted victory of democracy, which to revisionism as well as to bourgeois liberalism appears as a great fundamental law of human history and especially modern history, is shown upon closer examination to be a phantom. No absolute and general relation can be constructed between capitalist development and democracy. The political form of a given country is always the result of the composite of all those existing political factors, domestic as well as foreign. It admits within its limits all variations of scale from absolute monarchy to the democratic republic. We must abandon, therefore, all hope of establishing democracy as a general law of historical development even within framework of modern society. Turning to the present phase of bourgeois society, we observe here two political factors which, instead of assuring the realization of Bernstein's schema, led rather to the abandonment by bourgeois society of the democratic conquests of one up to now. Democratic institutions, and this is of the greatest significance, have completely exhausted their functions as aids in the development of bourgeois society, insofar as they were necessary to bring about the fusion of the small states and the creation of large modern states, Germany, Italy. They are no longer indispensable. Economic development has meanwhile effected an internal healing process. The same thing can be said concerning the transformation of the entire political and administrative state machinery from a feudal or semi-feudal mechanism to a capitalist mechanism. While this transformation has been historically inseparable from the development of democracy, it has been realized today to such an extent that the purely democratic ingredients of society, such as universal suffrage and the republican state form, may be suppressed without having the administration, the state finances, or the military organization to find it necessary to return to pre-March forms. The first pre-March refers to German institutions prior to the Revolution of March 1848, which led to some democratic reforms, editor's note. If liberalism as such is now absolutely useless to bourgeois society, it has become, on the other hand, a direct impediment to capitalism from other standpoints. Two factors dominate completely the political life of contemporary states: world politics and the labor movement. Each is only a different aspect of the present phase of capitalist development. As a result of the development of the world economy and the aggravation and generalization of competition in the world market, militarism and the policy of big navies have become, as instruments of world politics, a decisive factor in the interior as well as the exterior life of the great states. If it is true that world politics and militarism represent a rising tendency in the present pace of capitalism, then bourgeois democracy must logically move in a descending line. In Germany, the era of great armaments began in 1893, and the policy of world politics, inaugurated with the seizure of Tsingtao, were paid for immediately with the following sacrificial victim: the decomposition of liberalism, the shift of the center party from the opposition to government. The recent elections to the Reichstag of 1907 fought into the German colonial policy were, at the same time, the historical burial of German liberalism. If foreign politics pushed the bourgeoisie into the arms of reaction, this is no less true of domestic policies, thanks to the rise of the working class. Bernstein shows that he recognizes this when he makes a social democracy that wants to swallow everything responsible for the desertion of the liberal bourgeoisie. He advises the proletariat to disavow its socialist aims so that the mortally frightened liberals might come out of the mousehole of reaction, making the suppression of the socialist labor movement an essential condition for the preservation of bourgeois democracy. He proves in a striking manner that this democracy is in complete contradiction with the inner tendency of development of the present society. He proves at the same time that the socialist movement is itself a direct product of this tendency. But he proves still another thing. By making the renunciation of the socialist aim an essential condition of the resurrection of bourgeois democracy, he shows out and exacts his claim that bourgeois democracy is an indispensable condition of the socialist movement and the victory of socialism. Bernstein's reasoning exhausts itself in a vicious circle. His conclusion swallows his premises. The way out of this circle is simple. In view of that fact, bourgeois liberalism is given up the ghost from fear of the growing labor movement and its final aim. We conclude that the socialist labor movement is today the only support for democracy. We must conclude that the socialist movement is not bound to bourgeois democracy, but that, on the contrary, the fate of democracy is bound up with the socialist movement. Democracy does not acquire greater chances of survival to the extent that the socialist movement renounces the struggle for its emancipation. On the contrary, democracy requires greater chances of survival as the socialist movement becomes sufficiently strong to struggle against the reactionary consequences of world politics and the bourgeois desertion of democracy. He who would strengthen democracy must also want to strengthen and not weaken the socialist movement. He who renounces the struggle for socialism renounces both the labor movement and democracy. The conquest of political power. The fate of democracy is bound up, we have seen, with the fate of the labor movement. But does the development of democracy render superfluous or impossible a proletarian revolution, that is, the conquest of political power by the workers? Bernstein settles this question by weighing minutely the good and bad sides of social reform and social revolution. He does it almost in the same manner in which cinnamon or pepper is weighed out in a cooperative store. He sees the legislative course of historic development as the action of intelligence, while the revolutionary course is for him the action of feeling. Reformist activity he recognizes as a slow method of historic progress, revolution as a rapid method of progress. In legislation, he sees a methodical force, and revolution as a spontaneous force. It is now an old story that the petty bourgeois reformer finds good and bad sides in everything, and nibbles a bit at all flower beds. But in the real course of events, the carefully gathered little pile of the good sides of all things collapses as the first fillip of history. Historically, legislative reform and the revolutionary method function in accordance with the influences that are much more profound than the consideration of the advantages or inconveniences of one method or another. In the history of bourgeois society, legislative reform served to strengthen progressively the rising class until the latter was sufficiently strong to seize political power, to suppress the existing judicial system, and to construct itself a new one. Bernstein, thundering against the conquest of political power as a theory of Blanquist violence, has the misfortune of labeling it as a Blanquist error that which has always been the pivot and motive force of human history. From the first appearance of class societies, in which class struggle is the essential content of their history, the conquest of political power has been the aim of all rising classes. Here is the starting point and end point, and the end of every historic period. This can be seen in the long struggle of the Latin peasantry against the financiers and the nobility of ancient Rome, and the struggle of the medieval nobility against the bishops, and the struggle of the artisans against the nobles in the city of the Middle Ages. In modern times, we see it in the struggle of the bourgeoisie against feudalism. Legislative reform and revolution are not different methods of historical development that can be picked out at the leisure from the counter of history, just as one chooses hot or cold sausages. Legislative reform and revolution are different factors in the development of class society. They condition and complement each other, and are at the same time reciprocally exclusive, as are the North and South poles, the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. Every constitution is a product of a revolution. And in the history of classes, revolution is an act of political creation, while legislation is a political expression of the life of a society that has already come into being. Work for reform does not contain its own force, independent of revolution. During every historic period, the work for reform is carried on only in the direction given to it by the impetus of the previous revolution, and continues as long as the impulse from that revolution continues to make itself felt. Or, to put it more concretely, in each historic period, work for reforms is carried on only in the framework of the social reform created by the previous revolution. That is the kernel of the problem. It is contrary to history to represent work for reforms as a long, drawn-out revolution, and revolution as a condensed series of reforms. A social transformation and a legislative reform do not differ according to their duration, but according to their content. The secret of historic change through the utilization of political power resides precisely in the transformation of simple quantitative modification into a new quality, or to speak more concretely, and the passage of a historic period from one given form of society to another. That is why those who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform, in place of and in contrast to the conquest of political power and social revolution, do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they stand for the minor modification of the old society. From the political conception of revisionism, we arrive at the same conclusion that is reached when we follow the economic theories of revisionism. Our program becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism, not the suppression of the wage labor system, but the diminution of exploitation. That is, the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of suppression of capitalism itself. Does the reciprocal role of legislative reform and revolution apply only to the class struggle of the past? It is possible that now, as a result of the development of the bourgeois judicial system, the function of moving society from one historic phase to another belongs to legislative reform, and that the conquest of state power by the proletariat has really become an empty phase, as Bernstein puts it. The very opposite is true. What distinguishes bourgeois society from other class societies, from an ancient society, and from the order of the Middle Ages? Precisely the fact that class domination does not rest on acquired rights, but on real economic relations. The fact that wage labor is not a juridical relation, but purely an economic relation. In our juridical system, there is not a single legal formula for the class domination of today. The few remaining traces of such formulas of class domination, such as those laws concerning servants, are survivals of feudal society. How can wage slavery be suppressed in a legislative way if wage slavery is not expressed in laws? Bernstein, who would do away with capitalism by means of legislative reforms, finds himself in the same situation as Uspensky's Russian policeman, who said, "Quickly I seized the rascal by the collar, but what do I see? The confounded fellow had no collar." And that is precisely Bernstein's difficulty. All previous societies were based on an antagonism between an oppressing class and an oppressed class, Communist Manifesto. But in the preceding phases of modern society, this antagonism was expressed in distinctly determined judicial relations and could, especially because of that, accord to a certain extent, a place to new relations within the framework of the old. In the midst of serfdom, the serf raised themselves to the rank of a member of the town community. Communist Manifesto. How is that made possible? It was made possible by the progressive suppression of all feudal privileges in the environs of the city, the corvée. The right to special dress, the inheritance tax, the lord's claim to the best cattle, the personal levy, marriage under duress, the right to succession, etc., which altogether constituted serfdom. In the same way, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, the petty bourgeois raised himself to the rank of bourgeoisie, Communist Manifesto. By what means? By means of the form of partial suppression or actual loosening of the bonds of the guild, by the progressive transformation of the fiscal administration end of the army. Consequently, when we consider the question from the abstract viewpoint and not from the historic viewpoint, we can imagine, in view of the former class relations, a legal passage, according to the reformist method, from feudal society to bourgeois society. But what do we see in reality? In reality, we see that legal reforms not only do not obviate the need for the seizure of political power by the bourgeoisie, but have, on the contrary, prepared for it and led to it. A formal social political transformation was indispensable for the abolition of slavery, as for the complete suppression of feudalism. But the situation is entirely different now. No law obliges the proletariat to submit itself to the yoke of capitalism. Poverty, the lack of means of production, obliges the proletariat to submit itself to the yoke of capitalism. And no law in the world can give to the proletariat the means of production while it remains in the framework of bourgeois society, for not laws but economic development have torn the means of production from the producer's possession. And neither is the exploitation within the system of wage labor based on laws. The level of wages is not fixed by legislation but by economic factors. The phenomenon of capitalist exploitation does not rest on a legal disposition, but on the purely economic fact that labor power plays in this exploitation the role of a commodity possessing, among other characteristics, the agreeable quality of producing value, more than the value it consumes in the form of the laborer's means of subsistence. In short, the fundamental relations with the domination of the capitalist class cannot be transformed by means of legislative reforms on the basis of capitalist society, because these relations have not been introduced by bourgeois laws, nor have they received the form of such laws. Apparently, Bernstein is not aware of this, for he speaks of socialist reforms. On the other hand, he seems to implicitly recognize it when he writes on page 10 of his book. The economic motives act freely today, while formerly it was masked by all kinds of relations of domination, by all sorts of ideology. It was one of the peculiarities of the capitalist order that, within it, all the elements society first assume in their development a form not approaching socialism, but, on the contrary, a form moving more and more away from socialism. Production takes on a progressively increasing social character. But under what form is the social character of capitalist production expressed? It is expressed in the form of the large enterprise, in the form of the shareholding concern, the cartel, within which capitalist antagonisms, capitalist exploitation, the oppression of labor power are augmented to the extreme. In the army, capitalist development leads to the extension of the obligatory military service, to the reduction of the time of service. Consequently, it approaches a popular militia. But all of this takes place under the form of modern militarism, in which the domination of the people by the military state and the class character of the state manifest themselves most clearly. In the field of political relations, the development of democracy brings, in the measure that it finds favorable soil, the participation of all popular strata in political life, and consequently some form of people state. But this participation takes the form of bourgeois parliamentarism, in which class antagonisms and class dominations are not done away with, but are, on the contrary, displayed in the open. Precisely because capitalist development moves through these contradictions, it is necessary to extract the kernel of socialist society from its capitalist shell. Precisely for this reason must the proletariat seize political power and suppress completely the capitalist system. Of course, Bernstein draws other conclusions. If the development of democracy leads to the aggravation and not to the lessening of capitalist antagonisms, social democracy, he answers us, in order to not render its task more difficult, must by all means try to stop social reforms and the extension of democratic institutions. Indeed, that would be the right thing to do if social democracy found to its taste in the petty bourgeois manner, the feudal task of picking out all the good sides of history and rejecting the bad sides of history. However, in that case, it should at the same time try to stop capitalism in general, for there is no doubt that latter is the rascal placing all these obstacles in the way of socialism. But capitalism furnishes, besides the obstacles, also the only possibilities of realizing the socialist program. The same can be said of democracy. If democracy has become superfluous or annoying to the bourgeoisie, it is on the contrary necessary and indispensable to the working class. It is necessary to the working class because it creates political forms, autonomous administration, electoral rights, etc., which will serve the proletariat as fulcrums in its task of transforming bourgeois society. Democracy is indispensable to the working class because only through the exercise of its democratic rights in the struggle for democracy can the proletariat become aware of its class interests and its historic task. In a word, democracy is indispensable not because it renders superfluous the conquest of political power by the proletariat, but because it renders this conquest of power both necessary and possible. When Engels, in his preface to the class struggles in France, revised the tactics of the modern labor movement and urged the legal struggle as opposed to the barricades, he did not have in mind, this comes out of every line of the preface, the question of a definite conquest of political power, but the contemporary daily struggle. He did not have in mind the attitude that the proletariat must take towards the capitalist state at the same time of the seizure of power, but the attitude of the proletariat while within the bounds of the capitalist state. Engels was giving directions to the proletariat oppressed and not to the proletariat victorious. On the other hand, Marx's well-known declaration on the agrarian question in England, Bernstein leans on it heavily, in which he says, "We shall probably succeed easier by burying the estates of the landlords," does not refer to the stand of the proletariat before, but after its victory. For there evidently can be a question of buying the property of the old dominant class only when the workers are in power. The possibility envisaged by Marx is that of the peaceful exercise of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and not the replacement of the dictatorship by capitalist social reforms. There is no doubt for Marx and Engels about the necessity of having the proletariat conquer political power. It is left to Bernstein to consider the chicken coop of bourgeois parliamentarism as the organ by means of which we are to realize the most formidable social transformation of history, the passage from the capitalist society to socialism. Bernstein introduces his theory by warning the proletariat against the danger of acquiring power too early. That is, according to Bernstein, the proletariat ought to leave bourgeois society in its present condition and itself suffer frightful defeats. If the proletariat came to power, it could draw from Bernstein's theory the following practical conclusion: to go to sleep. His theory condemns the proletariat at the most decisive moments of the struggle to inactivity, to passive betrayal of its own cause. Our program would be a miserable scrap of paper if it could not serve us in all eventualities, at all moments of the struggle, and if it did not serve us by its application and not by its non-application. If our program contains the formula of the historical development of society from capitalism to socialism, it must also formulate, in all its characteristic fundamentals, all the transitional phases of this development, and it should, consequently, be able to indicate to the proletariat what ought to be its corresponding action at every moment on the road toward socialism. There can be no time for the proletariat when it will be obliged to abandon its program or be abandoned by it. Practically, this is manifested in the fact that there can be no time when the proletariat, placed in power by the force of events, is not in the condition or is not morally obliged to take certain measures for the realization of its program. That is, take transitional measures in the direction of socialism. Behind the belief that the socialist program can collapse immediately at any point of the dictatorship of the proletariat lurks the other belief that the socialist program is generally and at all times unrealizable. And what if the transitional measures are premature? The question hides a great number of mistaken ideas concerning the real course of a social transformation. In the first place, the seizure of political power by the proletariat, that is to say by a large popular class, is not produced artificially. It presupposes, with the exception of such cases as the Paris Commune, where the proletariat did not abandon power after conscious struggle but had it fall into its hands like an object discarded by everybody else, a definite degree of maturity of economic and political relations. Here we have the essential difference between coup d'etat conceived by Blanqui which are accomplished by an active minority and burst out like pistol shots, always and opportunely, and the conquest of political power by a great conscious popular mass, which can only be the product of decomposition of bourgeois society, and therefore bears in itself the economic and political legitimization of his opportune parents. If therefore considered from the angle of political effect, the conquest of political power by the working class cannot materialize itself too early, then, from the angle of conservation of power, the premature revolution, the thought of which Bernstein keeps Bernstein awake, menaces us like a sword of Damocles. Against that, neither prayers nor supplication, neither scares nor any amount of anguish, or of any avail, and this for two very simple reasons. In the first place, it is impossible to imagine that a transformation as formidable as the passage from a capitalist society to a socialist society can be realized in one happy act. To consider that as possible is, again, to lend color to conceptions that are clearly blanquist. The socialist transformation supposes a long and stubborn struggle, in the course of which it is quite probable the proletariat will be repulsed more than once, so that for the first time, from the viewpoint of the final outcome of the struggle, it will have necessarily come to power too early. In the second place, it will be impossible to avoid the premature conquest of state power by the proletariat, precisely because these premature attacks of the proletariat constitute a factor, and indeed a very important factor, creating the political conditions for the final victory. In the course of the political crisis accompanying its seizure of power, in the course of long and stubborn struggles, the proletariat will acquire the degree of political maturity permitting it to obtain in time a definitive victory of the revolution. Thus, these premature attacks of the proletariat against the state power are in themselves important historic factors helping to provoke and determine the point of the definite victory. Considered from this viewpoint, the idea of a premature conquest of political power by the laboring class appears to be a polemic absurdity derived from a mechanical conception of the development of society, and positing for the victor of the class struggle a point fixed outside and independent of the class struggle. Since the proletariat is not in the position to seize power in any other way than prematurely, since the proletariat is absolutely obliged to seize power once or several times too early, before it can maintain itself in power for good, the objection to the premature conquest of power is at the bottom nothing more than a general opposition to the aspiration of the proletariat to possess itself of safe power. Just as all roads lead to Rome, so too do we logically arrive at the conclusion that the revisionist proposal to slight the final aim of the socialist movement is really a recommendation to renounce the socialist movement itself. The collapse. Bernstein began his revision of social democracy by abandoning this theory of capitalist collapse. The latter, however, is the cornerstone of scientific socialism. By rejecting it, Bernstein also rejects the whole doctrine of socialism. In the course of his discussion, he abandons one after another the positions of socialism in order to be able to maintain his first affirmation. Without the collapse of capitalism, the expropriation of the capitalist class was impossible. Bernstein therefore renounces expropriation and produces a progressive realization of the cooperative principle as the aim of the labor movement. But cooperation cannot be realized without capitalist production. Bernstein therefore renounces the socialization of production and merely proposes to reform commerce and to develop consumers' cooperatives. But the transformation of society through consumers' cooperatives, even by means of trade unions, is incompatible with the real material development of capitalist society. Therefore, Bernstein abandons this materialist conception of history. But his conception of the march of economic development is incompatible with the Marxist labor theory of value. Therefore, Bernstein abandons the theory of value, and in this way, the whole economic system of Karl Marx. But the struggle of the proletariat cannot be carried on without a given final aim and without an economic basis found in the existing society. Bernstein, therefore, abandons the class struggle and speaks of reconciliation with bourgeois liberalism. But in a class society, the class struggle is a natural and unavoidable phenomenon. Bernstein, therefore, contests even the existence of classes in society. The working class is for him a mass of individuals divided politically and intellectually, but also economically. The bourgeoisie, according to him, does not group itself politically in accordance with this inner economic interest, but also only because of exterior pressure from above and below. But if there is no economic basis for the class struggle, and if consequently there are no classes in our society, not only for the future, but even the past struggles of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie appears to be impossible, and social democracy and its successes seem absolutely incomprehensible. Or they can be understood only as the results of political pressure by the government. That is, not as the natural consequence of historic development, but as the fortuitous consequences of the policy of Hohenzollern. I'm, yeah, this German word, which has a footnote. Footnote says the family that produced Prussian monarchy. So that's the Hohenzollern. Not as the legitimate offspring of capitalist society, but as the bastard children of reaction. Rigorously logical in this respect, Bernstein passes from the materialist conception of history to the outlook of the Frankfurter Zeitung and the Vossische Zeitung, which that's the names of two well-known liberal periodicals. After rejecting socialist criticism of capitalist society, it is easy for Bernstein to find the present state of affairs satisfactory, at least in a general way. Bernstein does not hesitate. He discovers at the present time reaction is not very strong in Germany, that we cannot speak of political reaction in the countries of Western Europe, and that in all the countries of the West, the attitude of the bourgeois classes toward the socialist movement is at most an attitude of defense and not one of oppression. Far from becoming worse, the situation of the workers is getting better. Indeed, the bourgeoisie is politically progressive and morally sane. We cannot speak either of reaction or repression. All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. That line is from the character Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide, portrayed as an unremitting optimist despite the horrors of his time. Bernstein thus travels in logical sequence from A to Z. He began by abandoning the final aim and supposedly keeping the movement. But as there can be no socialist movement without a socialist aim, he ends by renouncing the movement. And thus Bernstein's conception of socialism collapses entirely. The proud, symmetrical, wonderful construction of socialist thought becomes for him a pile of rubbish in which the debris of all systems, the pieces of thought of various great and small minds, find a common resting place. Marx and Proudhon, Leon von Buch and Franz Oppenheimer, Friedrich Albert Lange, and Kant, Herr Pochovich, and R. Ritter von Neupauer, Höckner, and Schultz, I don't know how to pronounce that, Gavanitz, Lassalle, and Professor Julius Wolff all contribute something to Bernstein's system. From each he takes a little. And no wonder, when he abandoned the standpoint of the working class, he lost his political compass. When he abandoned scientific socialism, he lost the intellectual axis about which isolated facts groups crystallized into the organic whole of a coherent conception of the world. His doctrine, comprised of bits of all possible systems, seems upon first consideration to be completely free from prejudices. Bernstein does not like talk of party science, or to be more exact, class science, any more than he likes to talk of class liberalism or class morality. He thinks he succeeds in expressing human general abstract science, abstract liberalism, abstract morality. But since in society reality is made up of classes which have diametrically opposed interests, aspirations, and conceptions, a general human science in social questions, and abstract liberalism and abstract morality are present illusions, pure utopia. The science, democracy, morality considered by Bernstein as general and human are merely the dominant science, dominant democracy, and dominant morality. That is, bourgeois science, bourgeois democracy, and bourgeois morality. When Bernstein rejects the economic doctrine of Marx in order to swear by the teachings of Bertano Brombavic, Jevons, Say, and Julius Wolff, he exchanges the scientific basis of the emancipation of the working class for the apologetics of the bourgeoisie. When he speaks of the general character of liberalism and transforms socialism into a variety of liberalism, he deprives the socialist movements of its class character and consequently of its historic content, consequently of all content, and conversely, he recognizes the class representing liberalism in history, the bourgeoisie, as a champion of the general interests of humanity. And when he condemns raising the material factors to the rank of an all-important force of development, when he protests against the so-called contempt for the ideal that is supposed to rule social democracy, when he presumes to talk for idealism, for morals, pronouncing himself at the same time the only source of the moral rebirth of the proletariat, a revolutionary class struggle, he does no more than the following: preach to the working class the quintessence of the morality of the bourgeoisie, that is, reconciliation with the existing social order and the transfer of the hopes of the proletariat to the limbo of ethical delusions. When he directs his keenest arrows toward a dialectical system, he is really attacking the specific mode of thought employed by the conscious proletariat in its struggle for liberation. It is an attempt to break the sword that has helped the proletariat to pierce the darkness of its future. It is an attempt to shatter the intellectual arm with the aid of which the proletariat, though materially under the yoke of the bourgeoisie, is yet enabled to triumph over the bourgeoisie. For it is our dialectical system that shows to the working class the transitory nature of this yoke, proving to workers the inevitability of their victory, and is already realizing a revolution in the domain of thoughts, saying goodbye to our system of dialectics and resorting instead to the intellectual seesaw of the well-known, on the one hand, on the other hand, yes, but, although, however, more or less, etc., he quite logically lapses into a mode of thought that belongs historically to the bourgeoisie in decline, being the faithful intellectual reflection of the social existence and political activity of the bourgeoisie at that stage. Political on the one hand, on the other hand, yes, but of the bourgeoisie today resembles in a marked degree Bernstein's manner of thinking, which is the sharpest and surest proof of the bourgeois nature of his conception of the world. But as it is used by Bernstein, the word bourgeois itself is not a class expression, but a general social notion, logical to the end he has exchanged together with his science, politics, morals, and mode of thinking, the historic language of the proletariat for that of the bourgeoisie. When he uses without distinction the term citizen in reference to the bourgeois as well as to the proletarian intending, thereby to refer to man in general, he identifies man in general with the bourgeois and human society, with bourgeois society. Bernstein's book is of great importance to the German international labor movement. It is the first attempt to give a theoretical basis to the opportunist currents common in social democracy. These currents may be said to have existed for a long time in our movement, if we take into consideration such sporadic manifestations of opportunism as the question of subsidization of steamers. Which has a footnote. It says, in the mid-1880s, this issue split the SPD deputies in Parliament. The proposed subsidies would have aided companies connecting Germany to its colonies. But it is only since about 1890, with the suppression of the anti-socialist laws, that we have a trend of opportunism of a clearly defined character. Weimar State Socialism, the vote on the Bavarian budget, the agrarian socialism of South Germany, Heine's policy of compensation, Schufelstein on tariffs and militarism are the high points in the development of our opportunist practice. What appears to characterize this practice above all, a certain hostility to theory. This is quite natural, for a theory, that is, the principles of scientific socialism, impose clearly marked limitations to practical activity. Insofar as it concerns the aims of this activity, the means used in attaining these aims, and the method employed in this activity, it is quite natural for people who run after immediate and practical results to want to free themselves from such limitations and to render their practice independent of our theory. However, this outlook is refuted by every attempt to apply it in reality. State socialism, agrarian socialism, the policy of compensation, the question of the army, all constituted defeats for opportunism. It is clear that if this current is to maintain itself, it must try to destroy the principles of our theory and elaborate a theory of its own. Bernstein's book is precisely an effort in that direction. That is why at Stuttgart, all the opportunist elements in our party immediately grouped themselves around Bernstein's banner. The opportunist currents in the practical activity of our party are an entirely natural phenomenon, which can be explained in the light of the special conditions of our activity and its development. Bernstein's theory is no less natural in an attempt to group these currents into general theoretical expression, an attempt to elaborate its own theoretical conditions, and to break with scientific socialism. That is why the published expression of Bernstein's ideas should be thought as a theoretical test for opportunism and as its first scientific legitimization. What was the result of this test? We have seen the result. Opportunism is not a position to elaborate a positive theory capable of withstanding criticism. All it can do is attack various isolated theses of Marxist theory, and of course, just because Marxist doctrine constitutes one solidly constructed edifice, hope by this means to shake the entire system from the top to its foundation. This shows that opportunist practice is essentially irreconcilable with Marxism. But it also proves that opportunism is incompatible with socialism in general, that its internal tendencies to push the labor movement into bourgeois paths, that it tends to paralyze the completely proletarian class struggle. The latter, considered historically, is not identical with Marxist doctrine. For before Marx and independently from him, there were labor movements and various socialist doctrines, each of which, in its way, was a theoretical expression of corresponding to the conditions of the time and of the struggle of the working class for emancipation. The theory of basing socialism on the moral notion of justice, on a struggle against the mode of distribution, of class antagonism as an antagonism between the poor and the rich, the effort to graft the cooperative principle onto capitalist economy, all the nice notions found in Bernstein's doctrine, already existed before him. And these theories were, in their time, in spite of their insufficiency, effective theories of the proletarian class struggle. They were the children's 7 league books. They were the children's 7 league boots, thanks to which the proletariat would learn to walk upon the scene of history. But after the development of the class struggle and its reflex in its social conditions had led to the abandonment of these theories and to the elaboration of the principles of scientific socialism, there could be no socialism, at least in Germany, outside of the Marxist socialism, and there could be no socialist class struggle outside of social democracy. From then on, socialism and Marxism, the proletarian struggle for emancipation and social democracy, were identical. That is why the return to pre-Marxist socialist theories no longer signifies today a return to the 7 league boots of the childhood of the proletariat, but a return to the puny, worn-out slippers of the bourgeoisie. Bernstein's theory is the first and at the same time last attempt to give theoretical basis to opportunism. It is the last because in Bernstein's system, opportunism has gone negatively through its renunciation of scientific socialism, positively through its marshalling of every bit of theoretical confusion possible, as far as it can. In Bernstein's book, opportunism has crowned its theoretical development and has reached its ultimate conclusion. Not only can Marx's doctrine refute opportunism theoretically, it alone can explain opportunism as a historic phenomenon in the development of the party. The forward march of the proletariat on a world historic scale to its final victory is not, indeed, so simple a thing. The peculiar character of this movement resides precisely in the fact that here, for the first time in history, the popular masses themselves, in opposition to the ruling classes, are to impose their will. The masses can only form this will in a constant struggle against the existing order. The union of the broad popular masses with an aim of reaching beyond the existing social order, the union of the daily struggle with the great world transformation, that is the task of the social democratic movement, which must logically grope on its road of development between the following two reefs, abandoning the mass character of the party or abandoning its final aim, falling into sectarianism or bourgeois reformism, anarchism or opportunism. In its theoretical arsenal, Marx's doctrine furnished, more than half a century ago, arms that are effective against both of these two extremes. But because our movement is a mass movement, and because the dangers menacing it are not derived from the human brain but from social conditions, Marxist doctrine would not assure us in advance and once for always against anarchist and opportunist tendencies. The latter can be overcome only as we pass from the domain of theory to the domain of practice, but with the help of the arms furnished to us by Marx. Marx wrote half a century ago. Bourgeois revolutions, like those of the 18th century, rush onward rapidly from success to success. Their stage effects outbid one another. Men and things seem to be set in flaming diamonds. Ecstasy is the prevailing spirit, but they are short-lived. They reach their climax speedily, and then society relapses into a long fit of nervous reaction before it learns how to appropriate the fruits of its period of feverish excitement. Proletarian revolutions, on the contrary, such as those of the 19th century, criticize themselves constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, come back to what seems to have been accomplished in order to start anew, scorn with cruel toughness the half-measures, weakness and meanness of their first attempts, seem to throw down their adversary only to enable him to draw fresh strength from the earth and again to rise up against them in more gigantic stature, constantly recoil in fear before the undefined deformity of their own objects, until finally that situation is created which renders all retreats impossible, and conditions themselves cry out, "Hic Rhodus, hic salta." Here's the rose dance here, which is a reference to the 18th premier of Louis Napoleon. Okay. This has remained true even after the elaboration of the doctrine of scientific socialism. The proletarian movement has not, as yet, all at once become social democratic, surmounting continually the extreme deviations of anarchism and opportunism, both of which are only determining phases of the development of social democracy, considered as a process. For these reasons, we must say that the surprising thing here is not the appearance of an opportunist current, but rather its feebleness. As long as it showed itself in isolated cases of the practical activity of the party, one could suppose that it had been a serious political base. But now it has shown its face. Now that it has shown its face in Bernstein's book, one cannot help to exclaim with astonishment, "What? Is that all you have to say? Not the shadow of an original thought? Not a single idea that was not refuted, crushed, or reduced into dust by Marxism several decades ago?" It was not enough for Opportunism to speak out to prove it had nothing to say. In the history of our party, that is the only importance of Bernstein's book. Thus saying goodbye to the mode of thought of the revolutionary proletariat, to dialectics and to the materialist conception of history, Bernstein can thank them for the attenuating circumstances that they provide for its conversion. For only dialectics and the materialist conception of history, magnanimous as they are, could make Bernstein appear as an unconscious predestined instrument, by means of which the rising working class expresses its momentary weakness, but which, upon closer inspection, it throws aside contemptuously and with pride. Okay, guys, that's it. I'm finally done. Oh my god. My mouth hurts. Like, I've been reading so long and I've said so many words, my mouth and, my throat, I guess, legitimately is, sore right now. So, what do you guys think? You guys like it? You guys have any, important thoughts or, important things that you sort of, took away from it if you were here to sort of, hear the whole thing? And if you maybe saw the last part? I thought one thing that I thought was really important and interesting is just the sort of the way that Luxemburg identified how social democracy sort of is in a way inherently against socialism because it requires the suppression of socialism in itself because it adopts the capitalist and the bourgeois uh, systems of government. But yeah, when is this thing starting? I didn't think I was gonna finish so early. So I have 1 hour. It seems like I have 1 hour or 1 hour and a half until this thing starts. So hmm. I could probably actually just like start streaming again a bit later. Just like turn the stream off for a bit right now, and then start it again a bit later. Or unless there's something you guys want me to do in the meantime, I'm probably just gonna shut it off now and then start it back again later. Unless you want me to do something. Drink some water. I've only watched the stream so far. But I'm going to read the whole thing. It's very good from what I heard so far. Thanks for reading. Well, you're welcome. Okay. How many people are here? 4 people. Yeah, I might just shut it off for a bit, for like an hour, and come back when it's about to start. All right.